This is a war on religion. This is a war on the children. They give you the cure with the sickness. This is a war on tradition.
Hello, this is Dr. Kevin Cruz with the Truth, Faith, and Action Alliance, and we want to thank you for tuning into the truth about what's happening to our children. But before we get started, please don't forget to like our videos and subscribe to our channel. This is one of the best ways you can help others learn about our cause and what we can do to work together for a solution. Today we must address one of the more difficult and unforeseen aspects of the war against our children. Unfortunately, many of us are still unaware of how our children are being harmed by the healthcare industry. But as difficult as that is to believe, we're going to hear from two of the best doctors in the world who are able to document that this is indeed the case. First, we will hear from Dr. James Thorp, a board-certified OBGYN who specializes in maternal fetal medicine. Dr. Thorp has practiced for over 45 years and has been published extensively. He's been featured on the Epic Times, Tucker Carlson, Dr. Drew, The High Wire with Del Bigtree, Real America's Voice, and The Stu Peters Show. Next, we will hear from Dr. Peter McCullough, the world's most peer-reviewed and published medical doctor in the world. Dr. McCullough is considered America's foremost cardiologist. Of course, because of his expertise, he has appeared in more national interviews than any doctor I know of and has testified before Congress on multiple occasions. Lastly, we'll hear a small excerpt from Dr. Joseph Ladapo, who's the Surgeon General of Florida, as he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. I believe that if you give these doctors a chance, you're going to hear something that will change your mind about who we trust and what kind of medical procedures we should be subjecting our children to. Here's Dr. James Thorp, and he'll be immediately followed by Dr. Peter McCullough.
Thank you so much for having me here. So let's see, we'll go to there we go. I'm starting. I got 25 or 30 minutes, I guess. How many pastors out here? Wow. Can we just advance to the first slide? Let's clap for our pastors. Thank you. God bless you all. Now, how many followers of Jesus Christ out there? Yeah, baby. Okay, now this is a little bit more important here. How many of you believe in the Bible? How many of you believe that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God? Yeah. How many of you can prove it? Not quite as many hands. So I'm Dr. Jim Thorp. Mom was a labor and delivery nurse. She gave me my spiritual heritage. And I didn't remember this until I've kind of gone through a lot of traumatic events in my life. But she introduced me to Jesus when I was 3 years old. In my heart, I knew Jesus at 3 years old. Now my mother was a labor and delivery nurse. Now my father was not a believer at the time, but he was a highly technical scientist. He was a brilliant mathematician, and he was also a mechanical engineer from one of the best universities in the world, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So I got another part of my heritage from my dad. It's up here. It's focus on objective. It's proving by numbers. It's analytics. It's statistics. I believed with my heart. I believed with my heart. But I had to prove with my brain, or I couldn't live with my father. Fast forward. So, did you know that the Bible is the only scriptural book in the entire, well, not even scriptural book. It's the only book in the entire world that's ever been published that validates itself. Did you know that? Did you know that God said I know the end from the beginning. And it is only I that can prophesy that. No other God can do it except me. Did you know that in Isaiah 46? Okay, did you know that there are 300 prophecies in the Old Testament that specifically in detail prophesied minute, detailed comings of our Savior's Lord and Jesus Christ with his first coming? Did you know that? How many of you know a brilliant mathematician by the name of Peter Stoner, Professor Emeritus of Mathematics, Professor Emeritus of Astronomy at the University of California, Pasadena? How many of you, raise your hand if you've heard of this man? Excellent. Well, Peter Stoner said, okay, there's 300 prophecies concerning Jesus Christ from the Old Testament, right? I'm going to take 7 of those 300, and I'm going to develop, this is my shtick. This is the kind of stuff I like, that I've done my whole career. I'm going to take a mathematical model, and I'm just going to take 7 of those prophecies that were specifically fulfilled, and I'm going to calculate the probability of what it would take for just any human being in the history of the world to fulfill just 7 of those 300 prophecies. Keep in mind, this is probably the smartest mathematician in the world, Professor Emeritus, mathematics and astronomy. You know what the number was? Just 7 of those. 1 in 10 to the 17th power. That's 0. Okay, how many prophecies concerning the second coming of Christ? Anybody know? It's about 500. How many prophecies concerning the end times? It's over 3,000. The Bible has validated itself. Now, there's a lot of smart people out here in the Bible. How many prophecies are there in the Bible that prophesied, this is up my shtick, OBGYN, maternal fetal medicine, trying to, connect, validate my heart that I know Jesus Christ is my Savior with my head, with numbers, with the Bible. How many of you know the prophecies concerning a virgin birth of our Messiah, Jesus Christ? How many of you know the prophecies? Not many hands. Okay, you got one. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but Isaiah 7:14, is that the one you're thinking of? Anybody else? Anybody else? Well, that's awesome. Because I'm going to show you, as an OBGYN doctor, sperm and ovaries, reproductive medicine. That's my area of specialty. I'm going to show you that that's not the only one. Next slide, please. This is amazing. The first prophecy of a virgin birth was in Genesis 3:15. And can you read that? What it says is Genesis, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. What? Dear God, Jesus, Holy Spirit, they were all back there 6,000 years ago. Moses wrote this. The Hebraic capitalizes that. Did God mess up? What in the world is going on here? A man has seed, sperm. A woman doesn't have seed. A woman has ova. She doesn't have seed. Do you understand? So back in 1976, when I was doing my first OBGYN rotation, and I know in my heart that Jesus Christ was born from a virgin, but in my brain, I know how that works. The woman's seed is capitalized in Hebraic. That's the first prophecy in the Bible of a virgin birth. That's almost 6,000 years ago. That was 3,500 years before Isaiah 7:13. That got me started. Next. We all know this verse. This is a verse of my life, of my profession. And I just want to ask you, this is Psalm 139. This is an OBGYN maternal fetal medicine physician's verse. This is God speaking through David. I knit you together in your mother's womb. I made you fearfully and wonderfully. How many of you know that verse? Amen. All right. Okay. Now, wait a minute. Come on. Is this just allegory? Is it allegory do you really believe it? Or is it just some other, song and dance from David? Do you really believe this? I do. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. You don't need a doctor to heal you or a healer to heal you. You need the ultimate doctor to heal you, who is physician. And all of you some of you may have the gift of healing. It doesn't matter whether you made it through kindergarten. God endows the gift of healing. It doesn't come from doctors. I've prayed my whole life with my patients. I've seen so many miracles. Now, don't vomit. Next slide. If you are fearfully and wonderfully made, why are you injecting your babies from the fetus in the womb to 12 months of age with 44 vaccinations? That doesn't sound like God did a very good job. Are you serious? And they're working on more. Now there's 2 more in pregnancy. There's 2 more in pregnancy. Next slide, please. So, if this is the case, why has autism rates gone literally from 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 20 or 30,000 to 1 in 30 or 1 in 10? How is it this sudden infant death syndrome, a tragic, horrible condition? Why is it that there's a sudden surge? I have Utah State death certificate data, which is not whistleblower data, it's legally obtained, showing there's a 20-fold increase in sudden infant death syndrome since the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine compared with the prior 4 years. I have police whistleblowers who have contacted me, both in the United States and other countries, that tell me, Dr. Thorp, I want to talk to you. I want to tell you what's going on in my crime unit. Because you see, a sudden infant death syndrome, this is an unknown death outside of the hospital, And a crime unit of a major police force has to go in and investigate that. Could have been killed by the parents, could have been a shaken baby syndrome. Somebody could have murdered the baby. It's an investigative crime scene. So they have specialized units. I know a policewoman. There's been a crime unit that has investigated over 300 in a major city. I cannot tell you which city. I've talked to her for hours. I know her by name. I vetted her. I believe her. 300 cases. Do you know that 50% of those cases of sudden infant death syndrome occur within 48 hours of a vaccination? 80% of them occur within, listen to this, within 2 weeks of a vaccination. I'm involved in a case, multiple cases in this country and others. Why don't you come out? Please, come out. Speak the truth. I can't, Dr. Thorp. Why? They'll kill me. What do you mean they'll kill you? We're going to get Brandy Vaughanized. Who's Brandy Vaughn? Anybody know who Brandy Vaughn is? Okay, a few of you do. Yeah, she was a whistleblower. Who was it for? Merck? Watch her videos. It would allegedly, was pretty strong evidence, she was murdered by the pharmaceutical companies and threatened to be killed for several years in a very highly secured home in Silicon Valley. Look at her YouTubes. We don't want to be Brandy Vaughanized, Dr. Thorp. That's why we won't come out, and none of the other police will come out in the major cities. New paragraph. Next slide on new paragraph. I'm not dictating. How many of you know this book? How many of you know of this book? If you don't know of this book, please order it off Amazon. This is the most important book that you could ever read in your life for your families, for your children, for your knowledge. This is not a technical book. It's 500 pages with over 1,300 references. This book, Turtles All the Way Down, was published by two incredibly brilliant Jewish scientists in Israel in 2018 or 2019. They remained anonymous because anybody else who has attempted to write a book like this, be it American doctors, Paul Thomas, you name them, many others, have been personally attacked, threatened, and destroyed. So they don't go after their data, they only go after them personally and destroy them. These Israeli scientists said, we're going to stay anonymous. But this was reviewed by two experts at the major journal in a major university in Israel, and it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, equivalent to Israel, Yahashuatz or something, which means in Yiddish, I'm sorry, if Jonathan Kahn was here, he could pronounce it better, but it's like medicine is the Hebrew name. It's a major medical journal. And these two experts gave this an incredible review, and they got blasted. But to date, this book has been published. This book has been published for 5 years now. And do you know, not one expert in the world has ever refuted any of the facts stated in this book. Not one fact. This is easy to read. Please read it. You will see truth like you've never seen before. Extremely important book. Do you realize how many vaccines are on the schedule for the CDC right now? Anybody know? There's about 100. Do you know that the gold standard, and I don't want to get too technical here, but when we prove clinical efficacy, we only are allowed to do it by a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial. Let me speak English. That's where you randomly assign Mrs. Smith or Mr. Daniels to either a saline blank group or a vaccine group. Nobody knows. The patient doesn't know. The investigators don't know. The nurses don't know. Nobody knows. That's called a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial. In my life, I've designed many of those. That's what I did. I was a full-time clinician, but I never worked for the university. I never worked in full-time academics because I wanted to do my own independent research, and I didn't want to take funding from corrupted people to tell me what to do. 90% of investigators that take funding, guess what? Isn't that interesting? They come up with the exact same opinions as whoever's paying them, whether it's their employer or whether it's the grant of the NIH. True. Next slide. Next slide. Now this is very interesting. I'm not endorsing this website. I'm not endorsing any particular eschatological interpretation of Revelation. But I do find it very interesting. I do find it extraordinarily interesting that Revelation 18:23, did you know, the word sorcery, the Greek word, look it up. I have the Greek concordance in Strong's Concordance. Look it up. Where does that word come from? Pharmakia. That's an English root word of what? Pharmacy, pharmaceutical, and so on, pharmacy. So it says that sorcery is going to deceive the whole world. Is that interesting? Next slide. This prophecy has never been so significantly fulfilled. Next slide. Next slide. Nor has this one. Next slide. Many publications. This is my beautiful wife, Maggie. She's my better half, incredible researcher. We have about 15 publications on America Out Loud. Next slide. Next slide. This is the data that Pfizer tried to hide for 75 years. This is your data. You paid for the drug. You pay for your government to keep track of it. It's legally mandated, and they try to hide it for 75 years. This is page 7. You can go there right now. I've memorized 30 pages of this. This is their own data. Anybody that wants these slides, you can have them. I'll get them to you. Yvette's got them. This is the deadliest drug that was ever rolled out in history. There's 1,223 dead within 10 weeks. 1976, remember the swine flu? I was a medical student. Swine flu vaccine, 26 deaths, vomp, off the market. Turn of the century, 2000, rotavirus vaccine, no dead, just a few minor cases of bowel problems, ripped off the market. Now we got 1,223 dead in 10 weeks. Are you serious? It's ignored. Next slide. Go back to the last slide. Not only is this the deadliest drug by far and away, this is the most injurious drug that's ever by far and away. Next slide. This is the obstetrical disaster of this same document, page 12. I don't have time to go through it. Next slide. It's a vaccine. It's a COVID-19 vaccine. The most deadly drug ever rolled out in the history of medicine. Thank you. The most deadly drug ever rolled out in the history of medicine. Not Peter McCullough saying that. Not Jim Thorp saying that. This is Pfizer's own data that your government tried to hide from you. Go back to the last slide. And next slide. Keep going, I should say, not backward, but forward. And forward. And this is how many people have been killed in the United States, 714,000. You got 23.8 million killed and injured from the vaccine. Next slide. There's Florida deaths. There's your Florida deaths, 48,200, 1.61 million killed and injured by the vaccine. Next slide. I don't have time to, this is the only other reliable data. This is governmental data, bloody disaster. I'm lead author, McCullough's on there. Next slide. Next slide. Listen. Borla and Bancel with the vaccines, the CEO of Pfizer and Moderna, the butchers, have killed and injured 585 million global citizens. I'm a military historian. The two bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, okay, 94,000 injured, 105,000 killed. The most lethal drug ever rolled out in the history of medicine was in my specialty. Why didn't 60,000 OBGYNs know this? Because they were bribed. The injure to kill ratio was only 0.25. The COVID-19 vaccine, as of last September, has killed and injured 585 million global citizens. It makes the two atomic weapons look like child's play. It makes the two obstetrical drugs that have been the most lethal drugs ever heretofore pushed in medicine look like prenatal vitamins. And I can debate anybody in the world on this. I have so much here, but it's getting late, and you've been such an incredible audience. I am so blessed to be among you. I love you all. I love this church. And thank you, Yvette, and thank you for all the sponsors. God bless you all.
Many serious cases of cardiovascular disease arising in the young. And this is what we know. In 2020, COVID-19 illness itself rarely could cause myocarditis. I think I've seen one case now in my entire practice. In a paper by Tuvali and colleagues from Israel, they couldn't find any excess cases above the baseline. Daniels and colleagues studied the NCAA Big Ten Athletic League with at least 30% of the athletes getting COVID. They found about 36 putative cases of myocarditis, no serious outcomes, no hospitalizations and deaths. And what we know in the autopsy studies of people who have died of COVID-19, there is no signal that myocarditis played a role in a COVID-19 death. COVID-19 is largely a respiratory illness. And so what developed over time was a false narrative, and it came from automated codified data that relied on troponin. It turns out when sick patients are in the hospital and they have a blood test, cardiac troponin, which is routinely done, about a third are positive, as they are with other forms of pneumonia. That is not myocarditis. None of these cases were adjudicated. And so the American College of Cardiology is wrong when it says that COVID-19 illness causes more myocarditis than the vaccine. Dr. Anthony Fauci has said that. He's also incorrect. And again, the sources of data that show us that the illness does not cause significant myocarditis are Tuvali and colleagues, Daniel and colleagues, another paper by Singer and colleagues. And so what we know here is that myocarditis began to explode in 2021 with the release of the COVID-19 vaccines. Internal emails that were released via FOIA. The CDC knew about this in the April-May timeframe, and they delayed telling America until it was June of 2021 when the FDA and the CDC finally came out and said, yes, messenger RNA vaccines cause myocarditis. From that point forward, the peer-reviewed manuscripts began to pour in. We now are at many hundreds of manuscripts. Patone and colleagues demonstrated that both messenger RNA vaccines and adenoviral vaccines, Janssen and AstraZeneca, cause myocarditis. In fact, they had over 100 fatal cases. This is shocking. In the United States, Washington University, Verma and colleagues, New England Journal of Medicine in 2021 reported the first U.S. fatal case in the peer-reviewed literature. We had Choi in Korea. A young man dies after about 7 hours in the hospital, a terrible death. Autopsy shows fatal destruction of the heart, myocarditis. Gill and colleagues, 2 boys, 16 and 17 in Connecticut, take Pfizer. They die on days 3 and 4 after the vaccine, dead in bed. Autopsies confirm fatal myocarditis. We now have a collection of autopsies published by Holscher and colleagues in the Journal of the European Society of Cardiology. I'm the senior author, that are conclusive that COVID-19 vaccine-induced myocarditis is indeed fatal. Sadly, in the Holscher paper, none of the young people had a chance to get an MRI or even a diagnosis of myocarditis before the cardiac arrest. An analysis by Panagis Polycretis and myself of European athletes under age 35, active playing pro and semi-pro various soccer leagues and football leagues, has found a nearly tenfold rise in athlete sudden deaths since the rollout of the mandated vaccines. Now we have a situation where pathophysiologic studies are weighing in. Yonker and colleagues shown young Americans hospitalized at Harvard, Massachusetts General Hospital with myocarditis after the vaccine, that those young individuals who are suffering heart damage have unopposed spike protein in the bloodstream and ineffective antibodies trying to bind it. Probably what's called IgG subclass 4 shifting, whereas the children unaffected have adequate neutralizing antibodies. So it's quite a Russian roulette of who's going to actually raise spike protein and have it appropriately defended in the body, and who's not, and then suffering heart damage. Now Crossan and colleagues from Harvard has shown messenger RNA stuck in the heart with surrounding inflammation and damage, probably due to the spike protein. Schreckenberg and colleagues have demonstrated direct cardiotoxicity of messenger RNA on cardiomyocytes, abnormal depolarization, repolarization, and contraction. And a bevy of studies now demonstrating inflammation directly in the heart. Baumeier and colleagues showed that actually in living young individuals in Germany who had cardiac biopsies. And I think one of the most disturbing cardiac papers that's weighed in is by Nakahara and colleagues, roughly 700 vaccinated, 300 unvaccinated. They were having PET scans for other reasons, but the surprise finding was that those who took the vaccine, they all had an abnormal shift from using free fatty acids as substrate, which is normal in the heart, to 18-fluorodeoxyglucose. This is in a diseased pattern or an ischemic pattern seen in the myocardium, and it was uniform. In fact, those with a sore arm had a greater and more intense uptake of 18-FDG. So as we sit here today, the messenger RNA vaccines in particular are directly cardiotoxic. They install the genetic code for the spike protein, which damages the heart muscle and causes inflammation. The vaccines cause universally a change, a metabolic change in the heart of those taking the vaccine, seen out to at least 6 months, which was disturbing. I think it's probably explained by microaggregation of red blood cells in the small capillaries in the heart, causing a degree of subclinical ischemia. I think that's the best explanation that we have right now. And then a very disturbing pattern of autopsy confirmed sudden cardiac death, and then broadly epidemiologically a giant surge in cardiac arrests among young people who have taken the vaccine. As we sit here today, the next young person who dies suddenly with no antecedent disease in perfect health, if they have taken a COVID-19 vaccine at any time, the cause of death is most likely the vaccine until proven otherwise. This should be a call for immediate removal of the COVID-19 vaccines from the marketplace. In fact, in 2022 in the US Senate, I made that call. I followed it up with calls in the European Parliament, the EU Parliament, the Brazilian Parliament, now in 2024 in the US House of Representatives. Multiple state houses of legislation, I've made the call, and I'm not alone. The Association of American Physicians and Surgeons has an official recall message on their website, pull the vaccines off the market. The World Council for Health is also calling for the vaccines to be pulled off the market. We have a couple hundred lawmakers now who are calling for the vaccines to be pulled off the market. And yet our US FDA and its supervisory body, the Health and Human Services Department, are turning a blind eye to safety and still advising more vaccines. In those elderly, those with immune compromise, following the government schedule, an individual could be on their 9th, even their 12th shot of messenger RNA vaccines. We've never had a vaccine that's ever been genetic, let alone given by serial administrations every 3 to 6 months apart, with this many cumulative administrations. This is greatly disturbing. There are no studies of cumulative toxicity or safety. And everything we've learned about the vaccines from a cardiovascular perspective leads us to believe that they are cardiotoxic. They damage the heart to some degree, and they are directly responsible for precipitating sudden death. I'll say parenthetically that there are patients who develop heart failure. I've seen them in my practice due to the vaccine, atrial fibrillation, ventricular arrhythmias, aortic and other vascular dissections, and progression of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. But the data on myocarditis is so clear. The agency's acceptance of myocarditis, the FDA and the CDC, that readily accept the vaccines cause myocarditis. And this is, by the way, fully accepted in the UK by the MHRA, TGA in Australia, and all the other regulatory bodies. Myocarditis alone is a reason to defer and decline any additional COVID-19 vaccination. And in my view, a strong rationale among all the other side effects that patients get with COVID-19 vaccines and the sharply increased rates of the risk of death on the unvaccinated, to have all the vaccines pulled off the market. That's my message. I want to thank Yvette and the meeting planners for putting this together. I'm sorry I can't be with you personally, but I want this message to be crisp and clear. The COVID-19 vaccines are not safe for human use. Please join me in calling for them to be removed from the market and remove this public health consumer product safety issue from the lives of Americans. Some people still don't know, and they're at risk with every shot they take. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough, practicing internist and cardiologist in Dallas, Texas. Thank you so much for joining us.
Once again, a big thank you to Dr. James Thorp and Dr. Peter McCullough for participating in the Save Our Children conference. It takes a lot of guts to go against any of the official narratives, and it can cost you a lot more than your career. Of course, I realize what I'm asking you to consider. Is it possible that the establishments we've been trusting with our health may not be our best choice? Here's a good example. In 2020, the United States of America ranked 46th in the world in life expectancy. Now, I don't know about you, but this kind of information calls into question everyone we've been listening to with regard to healthcare here in America. Certainly, it might be worth looking into what are the top 5 countries doing that we aren't. The other reality we need to consider is just how risky using medicine can be. Indeed, 128,000 Americans die every year as a result of taking properly prescribed medication. By some sources, this is the 4th leading cause of death here in America. Yet most of us act like there are no risks or contraindications when taking what is being prescribed to us. But if that were the case, why do medications have such a long list of contraindications? Listening to Dr. James Thorp and Dr. Peter McCullough is eye-opening because we realize just how dangerous these vaccine treatments for COVID really were. But do the risks involved with COVID-19 outweigh the risks from the vaccine? Most people will be shocked to know that according to Our World in Data, in 2017, 2.5 million people died of pneumonia. Once you add the 650,000 people that can die from the flu, you come up with a grand total of over 3.2 million people. When we compare this to the number of people who died from COVID in 2020, the initial number that the World Health Organization listed was only 1.8 million people. However, they would later increase the number to 3 million. Either way, there's no statistical difference between COVID in 2020 versus the flu and pneumonia in 2017. Not only does this not qualify as a pandemic, but in 2017, we never shut the world down, put on masks, destroyed our economy, or forced people to take vaccines. Still, one of the most obvious signs that we have been duped is the simple fact that when they came out with their cure for COVID in 2021, the death rate actually went up. This is especially significant when you consider that the Omicron variant of COVID-19 is less deadly than the original. But the real shocker came in the third and fourth quarters of 2021 when the death rates of people 18 to 64 went up by 40%. Of course, we didn't hear this from the mainstream media. We heard it from our life insurance companies. Now, when it comes to vaccinations, even the Wall Street Journal admitted that there was flimsy evidence behind the CDC's push to vaccinate children and that the COVID numbers were being inflated. Case in point, just listen to this admission by the New York Times. Now, if you thought there were 900,000 children hospitalized with COVID-19, wouldn't you want to vaccinate your child immediately? Yet the truth was there were only 63,000 children hospitalized, which was an exaggeration of 1,400%. So what was the real risk of COVID-19 mortality for children? According to the Lancet Scientific Journal, children ages 4 to 15 had a 0.00016 chance of dying from COVID-19. This is why Dr. Rand Paul blasted the CDC and Anthony Fauci for lying to the American people and pointing out that kids were more likely to die from suicide or from lightning than from COVID. The medical standard is not to prescribe, let alone force treatments upon people, especially if the risk is low. Furthermore, during COVID, America embraced a logical fallacy, which was to guilt trip people into taking something so someone else might not get sick. They also lied to us because they said it worked 96% of the time, when in reality, it didn't stop us from catching or spreading COVID. What we have here is fear mongering and the blind following the blind. However, by the middle of 2021, the truth about COVID and the vaccines was already out. We knew that Sweden was doing better than us, and they didn't have any of the restrictions that we did. The same is true for the Amish community right here in America. Indeed, while they were still pushing vaccines on our children, some countries around the world had not only stopped vaccinating children, but actually banned them. So if you're still trusting the establishment, let's ask ourselves a question. How did we do with COVID-19 compared to other countries? Unfortunately, America recorded the most deaths from coronavirus in the world. However, many people immediately discount this number because we know that the numbers in this country were dramatically inflated due to the guidance change in how we did death certificates, the inaccuracy of the PCR test, and finally, the financial incentives given for a COVID diagnosis. To counteract this effect, many experts indeed look at the excess number of deaths above the global average as a reflection of the real measure of how we did during the pandemic. The bad news is that there were only 6 countries in the world that did worse than we did. What I'm trying to help us see is that any basic examination of the official COVID narrative reveals major problems. This is a clear case where both the risks and the rewards have been grossly exaggerated and fear was used to push an agenda. Their experimental solution was rushed to market. Liability was taken away, and we still don't even know what was in those jabs. In light of these facts, the testimony of Dr. James Thorp and Dr. Peter McCullough made complete sense. But there's one other doctor's testimony that I want you to consider. Dr. Joseph Ladapo, the Surgeon General of Florida, has been exposing yet another potential grave danger posed by these vaccines, and it involves our DNA. Not only is Dr. Ladapo the Surgeon General of Florida, but he also graduated from Harvard with an MD and a PhD in health policy. Here's Dr. Ladapo's initial statement about the COVID vaccines. I'm calling for a halt to the use of mRNA COVID-19 vaccines. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have always played it fast and loose with COVID-19 vaccine safety. But their failure to test for DNA integration with the human genome as their own guidelines dictate when the vaccines are known to be contaminated with foreign DNA is intolerable. To add to that, here's what Dr. Ladapo had to say in one of his interviews about why the unique combination of Nobel Peace Prize winning mRNA, lipid nanoparticles, and contaminated DNA could tamper with the very substance that makes us human beings.
These vaccines have DNA in them. Everyone knows what DNA is. They're contaminated with DNA, and that's not necessarily a big deal. But it's a problem with these vaccines because the DNA hangs on with the mRNA and goes into people's cells. So this is a completely different risk analysis than other products that have had DNA. These vaccines are honestly, they're the antichrist of all products.
Now, if that was not a stern enough warning about some of the potential dangers we could have just unleashed, I want to play another small excerpt from an interview with Dr. Ladapo that Tucker Carlson called one of the most shocking conversations he has ever had.
Thank you so much for coming on. I remember at the beginning of the vax mandates, there were people on the fringes, as we say, who raised questions about the potential of this drug, this brand new, this novel vaccine, which wasn't really a vaccine, to affect people's DNA. And they were immediately described as crazy. Tell us your concerns, if you wouldn't mind fleshing out a little bit what we saw in that clip.
You know, it's so interesting to hear you say that, Tucker, because I had the same impression when people very early on were citing concerns about DNA. I think that really what was happening is that their intuition was informing them about a potential problem with these vaccines. And, you know, you showed that clip there. This one is sometimes I feel quite guilty dragging people through the scientific details, but I try and do it at a level that hopefully won't bore people to death or be too painful, because it is a very important issue and it's not a complicated issue. And it's important for people to recognize the difference between the honest facts, which is what I'm sharing, and the spin and dodge and look over here that you hear Dr. Califf at the FDA and other, Dr. Offit, other people sharing. So it's actually very simple. We all know what DNA is. This is our genetic blueprint, our gift from God. And this DNA can be affected, and that can be obviously a very bad thing. Sometimes it's affected in a way that makes people sick. Sometimes it can even be affected in a way that leads people to pass on characteristics to their offspring. In this particular case with the mRNA vaccines, they have DNA in them like many other vaccines or other biologic type of medications. And that, as I've said previously, is not such a big deal because fortunately DNA is not some big hairy monster that can, live forever when it's foreign in people's bodies. Our bodies have lots of mechanisms to break them down. But the problem here is that, for the same reason that scientists won a Nobel Prize, this DNA isn't like other DNA in terms of having a very hard time penetrating into cells. This DNA hangs on with mRNA in that lipid nanoparticle that people hear and frankly probably roll their eyes over. It hangs on with it and it comes into the cells almost certainly hitchhiking along with the mRNA. So whereas in the past, DNA would have a very hard time even entering cells, here the DNA is getting delivered into cells with the lipid nanoparticles. And that's a problem. And that's a problem because each dose of mRNA COVID-19 vaccine probably contains, it's been estimated, between billions and hundreds of billions of fragments of DNA. So this is a completely different risk analysis. That is obvious. You don't need a PhD to be able to figure that out. And the FDA's own guidance about contaminating DNA, published guidance, their words, never referred to by them, by the way, in their counter arguments, but their words are that there are situations when you need to confirm that DNA that is a contaminant or foreign DNA is not integrating into human DNA into the human genome. And there are specific tests, sequencing tests to do this, to make sure it's done. And what we did is we asked the FDA, well, have you done this? You've acknowledged this risk. Have you done this? And they came back with about 10,000 words talking about everything from what time the sun sets in China to, their third cousin's, bar mitzvah, and nothing about the specific question we asked, along with other questions, by the way, but nothing about that, which leads me to conclude they haven't done it, which is, it starts at crazy, but it ends at somewhere else. That someone could be just so nonchalant and frankly willy-nilly with something as precious and as sacred as our human DNA. So that's a summary, Tucker.
Do you think it's conceivably possible that the mRNA vaccines change people's DNA, or could?
It's absolutely possible. I mean, I wouldn't have issued this call to halt their use if that wasn't possible. On a factual basis, it is absolutely possible. There's zero question about that.
So there's so much more to this must-see interview, but I've only given you just enough to pique your curiosity. So please go to Tucker Carlson's Rumble channel and search for his uncensored interview with Dr. Joseph Ladapo. But Dr. Ladapo is not the only scientist who is recommending a global moratorium for mRNA injections. For the first time in a published and peer-reviewed paper, scientists are calling for a global moratorium on modified mRNA products after surveying data from Pfizer and Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine trials. The same paper also raised concerns of DNA contamination and possible corruption at the genome level. It's also important to note that Dr. Peter McCullough was one of the doctors signing off on the paper. On our podcast, we also asked Dr. Thorp if he thought the COVID-19 vaccines could have tampered with the DNA of our reproductive tissues, which would genetically poison future generations. His emphatic response was something you'll have to hear for yourself. Now that we've heard how the COVID vaccines have the potential to change or damage our genetic markers, I need to explain to you why that is the world's most dangerous idea. Not only do we know that God wrote our DNA, but within that DNA, God put the information that determines our nature and our identity as his children. Our unique genetic markers are why we are created in God's image. And just like any other father, all of God's children have his DNA. But there's a new religion in the world called transhumanism that wants to change our DNA and change the image that we were created in, which means that our DNA may have been Satan's target all along. How dangerous is this? Within 3 to 4 generations, these genetic markers would spread throughout the human race. Of course, I realize that this may be a new topic for most of us, but in 2020, I began writing a book called The COVID Beast, which not only discusses the potential contamination of our DNA with COVID vaccines, but also the genetic narratives within our Bible and their prophetic manifestation in the modern world. You can receive a free Audible download of my book by going to thesupernaturaljunkies.com or simply using the QR code on the screen and enter the coupon code STANDUP. We also covered these and many other difficult subjects on our 100 plus episodes of the Supernatural Junkies podcast. Now, to find out more about how we can save our children, please visit our website at truthfaithanaction.org. You can also get in touch with us at info@truthfaithanaction.org. Of course, like any other ministry, we could use your financial support. So please use the QR code at the end of this video to donate directly. As this session ends, I realize that today we have covered what may be the most difficult part to understand in the war for our children. But if you believe in Bible prophecy, then you know we have been warned in Revelations 13, verses 16 to 18, about an evil government that will rise in the end times through some kind of unknown cause. This incident will justify mandatory access to our bodies, to identify us, and to control our ability to buy and sell or have a job. Consequently, we must be willing to defend these freedoms and especially our rights to our bodies and our temple. Logically, once we resign ourselves to the fact that the COVID-19 virus was man-made, it means that someone, purposely released this on the world. But of all the things to lose, we don't want to allow anyone to tamper with the words God wrote into our DNA, because this will harm our children forever. That's why now is the time to trust in the Lord and remember that being healthy and cultivating God's natural immunity is the best way to deal with any pandemic. May God bless you as the Holy Spirit helps us contemplate the difficult words we have shared with you today. And I hope you'll join me next video as we talk about sex trafficking here in America and around the world.
I'm Alex, and I'm super.
I'm Dr. Thomas Dozier, and I am also super. Hi, I'm Dr. Dennis, and I am the natural.
Hey, I'm Dr. Kevin. That makes me the junkie. Oh, yeah. And we are
The Supernatural Junkies.
And we talk about all the things that you can't talk about in the church today.
And I like to talk about strengthening your faith, conspiracies, and how everything on TV is programming you. I like to talk about how our Bible is relevant, whether you're talking about artificial intelligence, so-called aliens, or secret societies. By the way, I know what Dr. Cruz likes to talk about as well.
Spoiler alert, I like to talk about how current events are prophetic and exactly what our Bibles warned us would happen. Alex, what's your jam?
I like to talk about ghosts, aliens, demon baby, supernatural healing, you name it. Be sure to check out our 100+ episodes on places like Audible, iPodcast, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. Just search for the Supernatural Junkies wherever you podcast. Also, don't forget to like us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.